Welcome to the Outthinkers podcast. Plug into fascinating minds and breakthrough ideas that are transforming industries and the world. I'm your host, Ivan Krippendorf, founder of Outthinker Networks, a global think tank comprised of corporate strategists, innovators, and entrepreneurs that are shaping the future of business. If this describes you, join us at outthinker.com. Now, let's dive into this week's episode.
The idea that families themselves can provide a unique source of stability is something that we highlight throughout the book. And it's precisely because when they work well, families represent an inherent and an instinctive source of trust. But the families themselves are also inclined to focus on, again, longer-term performance because they're multi-generational in their orientation. They have an amazing capacity to build institutional memory and transfer that knowledge and that resilience across generations. They share their wisdom on how they've successfully navigated through crises with each rising generation.
Welcome to the Outthinkers podcast. Plug into fascinating minds and breakthrough ideas that are transforming industries and the world. I'm your host, Ivan Krippendorf, founder of Outthinker Networks. We're a global think tank comprised of corporate strategists, innovators, and entrepreneurs that are shaping the future of business. If this describes you, join us at outthinker.com. Now, you just heard from Devin DeCiantis. He is the co-author with Ivan Lansberg of the 2024 book, The Enduring Enterprise: How Family Businesses Thrive in Turbulent Conditions. He is a managing director at Lansberg Gersick Advisors, LGA, an advisory and educational partner trusted by many of the world's largest family enterprises. Devin's work and focus is on the financial, organizational, and strategic aspects of this, I would say, understudied and underappreciated business form, the family enterprise. Devin brings his background in corporate strategy, economic analysis, and investment banking to his work with these family businesses, family offices, and family foundations. As you heard in the highlighted clip, there are several unique attributes that set family businesses apart from the various corporate forms, whether public or private, corporations or limited liability corporations or partnerships. Many of these differences build natural immunity and provide competitive advantage of a sorts that traditional corporations struggle to build. In this episode, we discussed some of the key findings of his book, including what enduring lessons family businesses can teach regular corporations about planning for not just quarters, but quarter centuries. The unique advantages and weaknesses of family businesses whose longevity often span decades or even centuries. The unique role family businesses play in economies, especially in markets like South Asia, East Asia, and Latin America. The 7 stabilizing strategies that these types of businesses employ effectively, as they often are built amidst emerging and frontier economies where basic infrastructure and resources are often lacking. Ladies and gentlemen, Devin DeCiantis. Devin, thank you so much for taking the time to sit down with us. I've really enjoyed your book, and I'm looking forward to diving into at least some of it.
Thanks so much for having me.
Let's start with the same 2 questions I ask all of our guests. The first one is, just for us to get to know you a little bit more personally, could you complete the sentence for me? If you really know me, you know that.
I am deeply curious. And over the years, this has really translated into a wide range of interests and hobbies, actually many of which informed our research and writing of the book. That goes from economics and political science to evolutionary biology and competitive sport, astronomy and music. All of these disparate domains actually compete for my attention and my time. And it's actually part of what makes me admire folks like you who get to interview a vast array of people from all walks of life and tease out both the inspiring diversity and the reassuring familiarity of the human experience.
The reassuring familiarity. I love that. We could explore the things that you're curious about. Let's zoom in on strategy, since that's our primary topic of this podcast. What's your definition of strategy?
Sure. I think it's a terrific question. And I love how you've asked it of all your guests. Curious to see how mine fits into that panoply of response.
A lot of commonality, but never an agreement. So whatever you say is right.
That's good. That's reassuring. Exactly. There's no right answer. I actually like to think of strategy as a form of proactive planning and decision-making in service of an enduring mission. And that definition evokes some of the original Greek characterization of the general, the original strategoi, somebody responsible for managing matters both of competition and commerce. So practically speaking, for modern leaders, this involves first defining a clear and compelling North Star to orient the collective action for years to come. But then it involves staring out into an unknowable future and assigning a range of possibilities to various potential outcomes, and then ultimately taking decisions that will hopefully maximize the probability of achieving your desired future state. For many of our clients, enduring enterprises that we profile in the book, that goal is clearly multi-generational success. And one thing that makes that definition unique, at least in my experience, is that it naturally stretches out our strategic planning horizon across years and, in fact, even decades. So that requires the consideration of some more systemic challenges and opportunities that maybe other leaders and organizations might otherwise ignore. One of the most obvious being the longer term impacts, for instance, of climate change.
Yeah, that's great. I love that. And I love that about your work, that you kind of look at the firm not in isolation at the whim of the external environment, but as interacting within the system, the political, economic, social system. And I guess that becomes important when you have a long-term perspective, which is what families are kind of by nature, what they bring to it. So let's dig into this a little bit. There's a lot for us to cover. I just want to just open up with just some historical context. Can you just give some historical context of the family-owned enterprise? Like, how old are they? How old are they compared to, say, the corporation or kingdoms, or how long have they been around?
Absolutely. Well, I mean, as with all forms of private enterprise, they evolved in alignment with the evolution of the first frontier economies, in the wake of the economic development that proceeded out of the Renaissance, and as feudal economies in Western Europe in particular began to evolve into these early commercial domains where embryonic businesses, merchants, and traders began to swap goods and services in small medieval villages and at country fairs. These private enterprises and dynastic families began to accumulate wisdom and capital that would allow for them to translate and apprentice folks for generations. And some of the oldest companies in the world are winemakers and breweries and hotels and inns and so forth that emerged around that time. And so as an organizational form, there's quite a long history. The enduring enterprises that we study, the oldest in the book that we capture is actually a Japanese temple builder. It was established in the 500s. Yeah, Kongogumi, that had been around for over 1,400 years. And you would think that success, having survived all sorts of regime change and war and economic evolution and so forth over those years, in addition to all the challenges that come with just managing one's family continuously and in a coherent and harmonious way over time, that you would think that it would have continued. But it was actually the global financial crisis that brought Kongogumi to its knees, as the temple builder in its 40th generation of family stewardship eventually made some missteps, took on a little too much debt, began to diversify away from its more traditional artisanal heritage, and was unceremoniously acquired by one of its competitors. So it is in some ways both an incredible tale of entrepreneurial endurance and a cautionary tale that just because an organization has been successful for that amount of time doesn't necessarily guarantee its continued success into the future.
That's great. That's great. The lessons that we can learn from that longevity, also applies to the organization the lesson came from. But before, I want to get into why you decided to start studying family business. Before we do that, I'd love to just shape the perceptions maybe of some listeners of the family business. Wow, maybe they actually are very old, got that. But, aren't they sort of, you think of smaller mom and pop local businesses. Maybe you can give us couple examples of companies that give us some examples of companies that don't fit that model of being a small family business.
Absolutely. I think the first thing that maybe gets evoked in most people's minds as they think about family enterprises are the mom and pop shops that litter the retail landscape in our local communities, the dry cleaners, the restaurants, the convenience stores, and so forth. And it is absolutely true that the long tail of entrepreneurial activity is densely populated with family businesses, but they also represent some of the largest and most systemically important businesses in most major economies around the world and can represent up to 90% of all economic activity, employment, research and development, and so forth in most of the world's economies. In the United States, where many of your listeners are based, families like the Waltons control Walmart, obviously, and the Ox-Sulzberger clan that control the New York Times, and the Cargills and the Mars family. I mean, these are some of the commanding heights of the American economy, both in terms of retail, in terms of manufacturing, agriculture, mining and industry, oil and gas, information and telecommunications and so forth, are controlled by the same families that had originally founded those businesses and have done so and have passed stewardship of those organizations across generations successfully. And so part of what we were hoping with this book is to demystify this sense that when we talk about family business, we're really talking about SMEs. And in fact, we are talking about some of the largest and most enduring organizations on the planet.
So what motivated you? You started touching on this now to start studying family businesses, and especially in that emerging and frontier economies, and why did you think studying family businesses could give us insights, into managing in more stable and advanced economies?
For the last 15 years or so, I've been studying and advising and teaching about family business continuity around the world. I've been fascinated by the topic, actually, ever since I met my dear friend and co-author Ivan Lansberg nearly 20 years ago. And he was the one who first introduced me to this new species of private enterprise that nobody ever taught me about in business school or in policy school, but is in fact the dominant organizational form, as we just mentioned. And as I began to learn more, I was instantly inspired by their longer planning horizons, their deep commitment to their stakeholders and their communities, their strong emphasis on family values and organizational culture. And as a former investment banker, I was also really impressed by how they tend to outperform non-family businesses over the longer run. You can look at any number of indices of family business performance, at least among those publicly traded, and then studies of privately traded family-controlled companies. And they do tend to outperform considerably their publicly traded non-family controlled peers. Additionally, you can look at some of the research and just search for oldest companies in the world, or take a look at any of the Jim Collins and Porras studies, good to great, built to last, and so forth. And you will see that family-controlled companies are disproportionately represented in the up cases of those books. And it's for a litany of reasons, many of which I just mentioned here, that they do tend to build themselves. Their orientation is naturally built towards success in the longer term. So they aren't immediately drawn or seduced by chasing efficiency and profits. Their orientation is not quarterly, but in fact, quarter century. And that's something that I've found working within these organizations and advising their leadership teams is truly a unique differentiator, and one that is quite compelling for many of the folks who interact with them in a variety of ways.
You also have this kind of distinction. I'm not going to get the wording exactly right, but there are stable advanced economies, let's say, and then there are the frontier, the emerging, that thing where there's less stability. You have interesting graph of the Argentine inflation rate over time, and it's very steep. What do you have evidence to show that the family-owned businesses are particularly adept as compared to non-family-owned businesses in those more volatile environments?
Yeah, there are two sets of data. One is just the prevalence in those environments, the fact that especially the further down that hierarchy of stability, as we flag in the book, in emerging and frontier economies, the preponderance of family-controlled companies increases. Their proportion of all economic activity grows up to 90%, whereas in more advanced economies, it tends to be lower. And there are a variety of reasons that help to explain that. But it's also that, you pointed your finger at an important structural difference between an advanced economy and an emerging or frontier economy. And it's a recognition, we need to recognize that all stability comes at a price. Whether it's funded publicly by the state or secured privately by families and companies. And so in advanced economies, where most of the time, we can trust that when we flick a switch, light will turn on. When we open up a faucet, clean water will flow that we can easily drink. When we tap on our phones, an Uber will shuttle us safely to dinner or bring our groceries to us. That level of stability and predictability allows private enterprise and private households to more or less plan for their own self-interest. They don't need to worry about infrastructures that enable all of that activity to proliferate. But further down the developmental ladder, there are many gaps in the institutions and infrastructures that support that kind of predictability. And so enterprising families have to take it upon themselves to invest in that stability internally. And that was the premise for our recognition of and our discovery, let's just say, of these themes, these strategic coping strategies that we found families around the world who operate in emerging and frontier economies, these turbulent environments, would consistently deploy. And we found this portfolio of strategies recurring across geography and across industry and even across time. And it's one of the reasons why we distilled them down into these 7, and we tried to highlight as many cases and examples from around the world as we could, so that we could inspire others to consider maybe adopting or deploying them in the face of turbulence whenever it emerges, even if they happen to be located in an advanced economy and sitting in an office in New York or London.
Yeah, and I think that advanced economies are only going to be experiencing more unexpected volatility. So we can all learn from them. Let's just briefly go through these 7. We won't go through each one by one. Just if you don't mind, just like kind of listing and describing each one so that our listeners can get the full picture first.
Absolutely. So there's 7 of them. In fact, there were more as we were originally going through our research, but these were the 7 that we found to be most recurring and most replicable. And I wish there was an acronym that would help you to memorize them better, but we've got plenty of content. So I'll quickly list them, and then we can maybe dive into one or two, and would welcome anybody to reach out if they want to talk through any in greater detail. But the first is differentiation, which is essentially, supplying an underserved niche in conditions that are otherwise hostile to traditional competition. We've got modularity, which is about developing a network of partnerships that can operate autonomously and share resources seamlessly. We've got redundancy, which is about investing in backup resources and processes for all essential systems and activities. We've got symbiosis, which is about coordinating actions and sharing resources across nested or independent systems of power and influence. We got migration, which is about moving into new markets as resources become scarce and conditions more hostile. We've got simplification, which is about reducing complexity to cope with chronic resource scarcity or societal instability. And finally, we've got diversity, which is about developing a broad array of capabilities and resources to minimize the risk of systemic collapse. And each of these 7, we dedicate an entire chapter to. We start that chapter with an iconic case, but then we dive into a bunch of ways in which leaders and organizations around the world can and have deployed them effectively to build stability internally in the face of external instability.
So we got differentiation, modularity, redundancy, symbiosis, migration, simplification, diversity. We love to go through all of them. We'll highly recommend people buy the book and dig into each one. With the time that we have, let's dive into differentiation, modularity, and redundancy. Just give an example of differentiation and that kind of illustrates its importance.
Differentiation was a stabilizing strategy that we observed countless companies deploying to achieve enduring success. And really, it involves focusing on underserved niche markets, and particularly in those volatile environments where resources and competition are scarce, and therefore there are natural barriers to entry that chase away all but the most intrepid of entrepreneurs. And the case that we feature in the chapter on differentiation is the Aji Group in Peru, who we like to think of as the poster child for how to effectively deploy this stabilizing strategy. And they're a company that was born during a terrorist uprising, if you can imagine that, a time during which the global beverage giants like Coke and Pepsi had stopped servicing rural communities. And the Ñaños family decided to launch their own local alternative, which they called Cola Real, using recycled beer bottles from their neighbors and their own homemade bottling equipment. And leveraging this ingenuity and this resourcefulness, they were actually able to survive and eventually even thrive in the face of this existential threat. And their experience not only shaped the company's unique approach to manufacturing and distribution, but over time, it helped them to become one of the largest beverage manufacturers and distributors in the world. I believe they're a top 10 distributor by volume currently. And we found many similar examples of this form of frugal innovation, as we call it, around the world, from South Asia to Africa to the Far East. There are phenomena in South Asia, for instance. The terminology of jugad, or frugal innovation, is one that has dominated the entrepreneurial landscape in that country. In Swahili, the term huakali talks about the informal network of entrepreneurs who will go and fix basically anything that needs fixing in the local economy. This sort of idea that necessity is the mother of invention. And there are these wonderful, intrepid entrepreneurs who are out there solving and resolving so many of the unmet needs that are prevalent in these more turbulent environments. We found to be a source of incredible inspiration. And the fact that it isn't just something that happens at the SME level, but that when deployed effectively and scaled effectively, you can actually build a large, globally competitive multinational business leveraging this stabilizing strategy.
I'm going to answer my question, and I'm probably not answering it correctly, but just to show you that at least I'm thinking about it, is why might we see that strategy be more prevalent in a family-owned organization versus non-family owned? And what I'm thinking is a family-owned organization might be committed to the family, the country, the community. So just pulling out, just, doing a Warren Buffett and just selling it is not the option. Instead, we have to lean in and figure out how to make it work. Is that at all part of the answer, or what else am I missing?
Absolutely. And I appreciate you bringing that up. The idea that families themselves can provide a unique source of stability is something that we highlight throughout the book. And it's precisely because when they work well, families represent an inherent and an instinctive source of trust. I mean, that trust is hardwired into our ancient brains, that idea of reciprocal altruism that ties us and binds us to our closest blood relatives and allows for us to presume trust until, of course, that trust is betrayed. But we presume trust of those that we know much more so than we do for strangers. And again, that's one of the biggest differentiators between an advanced and a frontier economy, is the degree to which we trust those who we do not yet know, both in social and in commercial affairs. But the families themselves are also inclined to focus on, again, longer term performance because they're multi-generational in their orientation. They have an amazing capacity to build institutional memory and transfer that knowledge and that resilience across generations. They share the wisdom on how they've successfully navigated through crises with each rising generation. They sit down on grandpa's knee and learn about the time in which, there's a wonderful story from one of our client families in Latin America of a father who was caught in Mexico on a vacation during a tropical storm with his small children. And heroically, they tied themselves to a tree overnight to ride out the hurricane that was barreling through. And they survived until the morning. And 2 generations later, the family is still retelling that story and continues to draw lessons in moments of adversity about how they've overcome some really terrific challenges in the past, and how their family is able to cope and with agility and perseverance, able to achieve lasting success.
I love that. Yeah, it's just this metaphor of throwing your hat over the wall. It's like you're committed. You're going to figure out how to get over that wall because of the commitment. I love that. So we could talk more about that, but let's talk about modularity, developing a network of partnerships that operate autonomously and share resources seamlessly. Maybe just describe that to us and explain why family businesses are particularly well suited to this approach.
Absolutely. So we studied many successful multi-generational businesses around the world and found that modularity was in fact a core driver of growth and stability among many of them, particularly once again in uncertain environments. And it turns out that the enduring enterprises who deploy this strategy are inherently more complex because of all these modular parts that need to fit together. But when these interdependent and independent parts are working together seamlessly in service of a common mission, the modularity can actually provide a powerful and lasting competitive advantage. So think of, for instance, a business like IKEA, also a family-controlled company that has leveraged modularity throughout their operations. They do this in business in terms of their product design, their store layouts, their flat pack logistics, and they're able to offer affordable, self-assembled furniture on a global scale. You can consider non-family example of Tesla and their gigafactories, where they build modularity directly into their manufacturing process so they can start and scale their building and just bolt on growth over time. All the parts are designed to be interoperable. And if one goes down, you can either leverage of the others or you can build in a new one and you continuously scale over time. We also talk about in the chapter on modularity the idea that this strategy can be deployed not just in business and operations, but also in ownership and various forms of franchise and joint venture have enabled companies like McDonald's and Caterpillar and Xerox over the years to partner with enterprising families in emerging and frontier economies as they expand into new markets with much greater confidence in that their local partners, these families who have boots on the ground, are able to tropicalize these Western businesses and Western products for local markets. And that approach was really pioneered by Ray Kroc in the 1950s, who mastered the model first domestically and then took it internationally. But it was quickly copied by many other brands. And in families, these enduring networks of trusted relationships can actually become among their most enduring assets. So if you think about, how these relationships need to be managed across time, managers at McDonald's will come and go over the years, but the family will remain. And so making sure that those relationships are being effectively managed and stewarded and handed off from generation to generation within the family, and that you're constantly connecting to the leadership teams of these Western multinationals is a critical skill that needs to be developed. And it's a critical source of insight, intelligence, capital, innovation that might not otherwise be accessible to families who are operating in some complicated environments. So in some ways, they are able to leverage of all of the R&D and investment and organizational sophistication of their Western partners, plugging them into this sort of modular network, this portfolio of franchise relationships that they manage domestically within their economies, but bringing the best of the world to their local consumers.
So, when I read through that, I was thinking about maybe 2 months ago, I was in India and doing some workshops. A lot of the companies doing workshops for family businesses, and you had like a jewelry company, right? They've got the import company, they've got the synthetic diamond company, they've got the diamond processing company, they've got the jewel design company, they've got the export company, they've got the import company, and each of those are run by a different family member, a cousin or something like that. So, and we were together with all of them together. I kind of felt like, they're running their own businesses, but there is this not underlying, this overlying commitment or something kind of connection, so that like, hey, it's not so much, hey, the profit that I'm making is coming out of you and the profit you're making coming out of me. So like something a little bit about like, what is it about the family enterprise that allows modularity to work or leads them naturally to modularity? Maybe that's the direction. Maybe but maybe there are other reasons.
It's a terrific observation. And we see this not only within families where, many times you'll have each of a number of siblings or cousins managing different operating companies, depending on their geography or the unique skill set of the family member and the interests of the family member. And maybe some of these operating divisions are in service of the skills and interests of those individuals. But in addition to that, this idea of a familial network and modularity in family goes beyond just one's own family. And we found this convention of familial networks to be pervasive around the world. So for instance, in China, this construct is called guanxi, and it's essentially that describes the relationship of reciprocal benefit between two unrelated families that can continue across generations. And it typically starts from a position of trust and sort of friendship and mutual support, but then it can engage in a form of commercial relationship that then transcends generations. And so the original partners to some form of collaborative activity hand off their partnership to their children and eventually to their grandchildren in these extended networks of families that provide access to ideas, information, capital, and labor that allow families to project their influence much further than maybe their own sort of in-house human capital might otherwise allow them to. And in Arab cultures, there's a similar construct that's sometimes called wasta. In Russia, the phenomenon is called blat, and so forth. In various countries, there's a similar construct where it isn't just within our family that we're able to project and trust that our siblings and cousins will be able to manage disparate parts of a business with trust and independence, but we can project and extend that trust to friends and family network that lives just beyond our blood relatives or our household, that also then projects our influence and capacity to grow.
And is there a mechanism for a non-family organization to replicate such a level of
It's a great question. I think the biggest difference between the way in which a family would approach building that kind of partnership and a non-family entity would consider it, is the commitment to it being relational as opposed to transactional. Families are innately relational in the way in which they try to build and invest in these kinds of interactions. They recognize that this isn't just a one-off, that this is an iterative game, and that, cheating you or, trying to get the most out of this particular transaction is not doing either of us any favors if we're trying to build something that we hope to continue for 20 or 30 years. So if we can escape from this more transactional mindset and shift into a relational mindset, we are evoking our inner family and projecting a familial network of our own out into these relationships that many families around the world use effectively to help build stability.
Yeah, that makes sense. The interdependence lasts longer than this transaction. I was thinking also probably there's some sense of identity as well. Some organizations are good at developing, even like alumni of some organizations. They're like, oh, you worked at wherever. And so
absolutely. Investment banks and management consultancies are quite good at that. That when people leave, at least as long as they leave on good terms and they go in industry, then you've got yourself a natural toehold into the organization. And the trust is built in directly to that relationship that might make the barrier to transact a little bit lower and therefore help you to outcompete for whatever.
Yeah, probably some common language as well, and norms and things. Okay. Anyway, we're reaching the top of our time with you. I think we should also just touch on redundancy, coordinating actions and sharing resources across nested and interdependent systems. It makes sense that, to survive and preferably thrive under uncertainty, you need redundancy versus in a stable environment, you want efficiency. You talk about just in time versus just in case. I think that's what you're covering here. Could you just talk to us a little bit about what redundancy is and why it's important and why family-owned companies are particularly attuned to it?
Absolutely. Again, when you're managing for the downside to protect against the worst possible thing happening as opposed to chasing the upside, then investments in redundancy don't feel wasteful. In fact, they're an essential form of insurance. And one of the inspiring cases that really helped to crystallize this idea for us was the Plaza Hotel in Port-au-Prince, Haiti, and the Pierre Louise family that has faced basically every form of calamity over the decades, operating in one of the world's most notorious failed states, and we asked them how they'd done it. And they said precisely by investing proactively in stability. And in this case, using strategic redundancy wherever they possibly could. So they deployed countless backup systems for power, for communications, for supplies, and even for their security. Their external security. They have even backup systems for their backup systems and backup parts for each of those systems, because none of those infrastructures on their own can ever fully be trusted. And we then took a look at, in fact, militaries where decision-making is often a life and death exercise. And they tend to take a similar approach. Again, given that human lives are at stake whenever their critical systems fail. And in the military, this approach of redundancy is often called a belt and suspenders approach, because you want at least two systems to help make sure you don't get caught with your pants down. Or as the old saying goes, 2 is 1 and 1 is none. And it's one of the reasons why the cost of military budgets has spiraled and is so large. But it's because these systems are so essential that you need to make sure that you've got redundant supplies available for key goods, for key materials, for key personnel, and so forth. When supply chains snarl in the middle of a battle, it's life and death. It's not just that, folks aren't going to get their gifts in time for the holiday.
Right. Or if you're going to have to pay a little more money. Right. That's amazing. Yeah. So I'd love to dig in further. That's the time that we have with you. So, people can absolutely buy the book. Maybe they can catch you at Harvard. Maybe they can catch you at Kellogg. They can certainly contact you through LGA, your consulting firm. How do you suggest people that want to learn more and connect with you, how do they do that?
Please reach out to us at LGA. You can reach us via email. I am a conscientious objector when it comes to most social media, but do have an account on LinkedIn, so feel free to reach out that way as well. And really appreciate hearing whether or not these ideas resonate and if you're able to deploy them so that we can share these lessons with others.
Well, Devin, thank you. I know it's been 2 decades of work and experience and study and encapsulating it so succinctly and elegantly into this book. Thank you for doing that, and thank you for taking the time to share some of that with us.
Thank you so much for inviting me to do so.